Hello. Welcome to North Country History. I'm Rob Berg. Today we're presenting another bonus episode of the podcast. Since today is Memorial Day, Monday, May 26, 2025, I thought that I would do something special in honor of the day to commemorate Memorial Day. And that led me to turn to Edward Hartwick. I've talked about Hartwick Pines before, and with Edward Hartwick, particularly in the episode that we did with Hillary Pines in February on Karen Hartwick and Hartwick Pines State Park. But we only touched a little bit on Edward Hartwick himself. And Edward Hartwick was who the park was named for. But he has an interesting story to be told, and I thought I would tell a little of that today on Memorial Day, because Edward Hartwick not only served his country as an officer in the United States Army, first in the cavalry in the 1890s in the West, and then in Cuba during the Spanish-American War in 1898, but then once again as an officer in the Army Corps of Engineers in World War I from 1917 to 1918. And it was then, while he was serving in France, that unfortunately he died in the service of his country. And that is what Memorial Day originally was meant to commemorate, was not just all veterans, but it was particularly those who died in the service of their country. Began in the Civil War or post-Civil War, but has continued through with all American dead, both during war and during peacetime. So today we'll talk a little bit about Edward Hartwick and also focus in on the 20th Regiment of Engineers, Forestry, that he served with during the First World War. So settle in, sit back, and enjoy the show. North Country History with Rob Berg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. Edward Hartwick is an interesting person to study. As I mentioned, he served in the military as an officer in the United States Cavalry in the 1890s, and then again as an officer engineers. He was actually a reserve officer, but ranked as a major in the what was called the National Army, which was the Army of Volunteers in the expanded Army during World War I. And he served as the commander of the 1st Battalion of the 20th Regiment of Engineers, and their job was forestry work, and his background aided well into this. But other than that, there's really not a whole lot that most people know about Edward Hartwick. So I really want to get into that a little bit here today and talk about the man behind the state park, you could say. He wasn't the one who created it. In fact, he was long passed away before the park was created, but he was involved with the those who made that park possible. And so why don't we begin from the beginning? Edward Hartwick was born in 1871 in the small town of St. Louis, Michigan. For those of you not familiar with St. Louis, it's nowhere near the size of St. Louis, Missouri. It's a small town kind of smack dab in the middle of the lower peninsula of Michigan in what's called Gratiot County. And it's about, I think now it's about an hour north of Lansing as you head north towards the Mackinac Bridge. But his family did not live in St. Louis very long. They moved to Grayling. About this time was when Grayling was being settled on the Au River. And his father, Michael, was the owner of one of the first hotels that was established in Grayling. And shortly after the establishment of Grayling and of Mike Hartwick's hotel, the lumber industry, the lumber business came to Grayling, mainly in the form of the Salling-Hanson Lumber Company. And again, we've spoken about that before, namely in the Karen Hartwick episode, because Karen Hartwick's father, Nels Mickelson, was the vice president of the Salling-Hanson Company. And the company originally was located in Manistee, Michigan, and they moved to the new location of Grayling, not only being centrally located in the middle of the Lower Peninsula, well, the north central part of the Lower Peninsula, but it was right on the AuSable River, and most importantly, a railroad track, what was originally the Jackson, Lansing, and Saginaw Railroad, later part of the Michigan Central Railroad line, came right through. And this is the same railroad that went through the lands that David Ward timber cruised, as we talked about that in the last episode. So this area was central to the lumber industry. And Nels Mickelson, Karen Hartwick's father, was one of the men who first kind of began the industry in the Grayling region. He and his partners Rasmus Hansen and Ernest Salling, along with other men, those were the three main partners. But there were others involved as well. But they located their company right in Grayling. And Nels Mickelson, he settled his family right there in Grayling. So did Rasmus Hansen. Ernest Salling operated out of Manistee and oversaw operations on that end of the company. But Nels Mickelson, his family included his daughter, Karen, nicknamed Bessie, and she was just about the same age as Edward Hartwick, I think maybe a year or two younger, and they became childhood sweethearts. And Edward Hartwick graduated from Grayling High School in 1888. It was the first graduating class of Grayling High School, and Karen Hartwick followed shortly thereafter. But Edward Hartwick had his sights on a military career. And in 1889, he was appointed to a position as a cadet at the United States Military Academy in West Point, New York. So he went off to West Point and trained to be an Army officer and received his commission upon graduation in 1893 and was accepted into the cavalry branch, and he became a cavalry officer. And at first, he kind of moved around to a couple of units, the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, the 4th Regiment of Cavalry, but finally was appointed as a 2nd lieutenant in the 9th U.S. Cavalry Regiment. This was one of the famed Buffalo Soldiers regiments. The Buffalo Soldiers were formed in 1866, and they made up, and they were not called the Buffalo Soldiers initially. That was strictly a nickname, but they were regiments of African American soldiers, many of them who were former slaves and who had fought for their freedom during the Civil War in what was then called the U.S. Colored Regiments. And that was still the term that was used during most of the period of the 19th century. And but it was made up initially of 6 regiments, 2 regiments of cavalry, the 9th and the 10th Cavalry, and 4 regiments of the of infantry, the 24th, the 25th, and I want to say the 35th and 36th. I'd have to look that up. But the reason why I don't remember those is that the infantry regiments were downsized to 2 regiments, and the 24th and 25th became the 2 regiments. The other 2 were combined into those that survived. And they served mostly in posts in the South and then eventually in the far West, in what we called the Wild West. And it was the Buffalo Soldiers, as they began to be known as, there's various reasons for the nickname. Some said it was an honorific term that the Native Americans, the indigenous warriors, gave to their opponents because they were as brave as the buffalo, the bison. Others said it was because of their characteristics of their hair. It was like tufted like a buffalo. I don't know. That's not my favorite reasoning for it. I like the latter, or the former one, the original, or the first one there of the bravery. But regardless of what it is, they were known as the Buffalo Soldiers, and it became a term of endearment. But they were mostly posted to isolated posts in the West. And Edward Hartwick, when he joined the 9th Regiment, they were posted at Fort Robinson in northwestern Nebraska. And Fort Robinson is in a desolate location today. It was even more so in the 1890s when Lieutenant Hartwick joined the regiment. And his position as second lieutenant, he was the lowest of all commissioned officers. The main thing that lieutenants were told was to listen to their sergeants. Their sergeants were the backbone of the regiment, of the companies, the platoons. They were the men that the enlisted men looked to for leadership. They were generally older men, veterans. In this case, many of them were veterans of the Civil War, and we're looking at 30 years back now. Most of the older sergeants were retired, but there were still a few of them who had joined after the Civil War and had fought in the original volunteer colored regiments. And there's no way of getting around that term, unfortunately. But as it was, these were the men that young lieutenants like Edward Hartwick looked to learn the true leadership of their regiments. And those that learned that lesson continued on in the Army. And they might not have stayed for long periods of time. Promotion in the Army was very slow in the 19th century. The best time to be promoted was in a time of war. And unfortunately, there were not many wars going on in the 1890s. Most of the so-called Indian Wars had passed. There would be a few brief flare-ups, the last one being Wounded Knee, that happened in the 1890s in South Dakota, not far from where Fort Robinson is located. But unfortunately, you're not going to move very fast. And while he was at Fort Robinson, Edward Hartwick did come into contact with certain, with Army officers that would help him later in his career, and he would get to know. And the first one of those was, at the time, Major Adna R. Chaffee. And Major Chaffee was the adjutant of the 9th Regiment. So he was in a, he wasn't the adjutant. The adjutant is usually a junior officer aide. I can't remember what his level of position was. I believe he may have been the second in command of the regiment at that time. And Major Chaffee was a good role model for Lieutenant Hartwick. He had been a veteran of the Civil War. He started out as an enlisted man and was then promoted to sergeant, and then given a commission as a second lieutenant, and rose through the ranks during that time period. In the peacetime, he did rise up to major. And when the Spanish-American War broke out, he was given a commission as a brigadier general of volunteers, and would lead a brigade and then a division in Cuba during the fight in the Santiago campaign. and he would be a commanding officer of Lieutenant Hartwick during that time period. And they recognized that Hartwick was a good officer. He was very good in his orders, his organization of his commands. He did end up serving as the adjutant of the Ninth Cavalry during the Battle of San Juan Hill, and the adjutant was basically the personal aide messenger of the commanding officer. At that time, it was Lieutenant Colonel Hamilton, who was killed in action during the Santiago campaign. But Lieutenant Hartwick was made mention by another particular individual who became well-known nationally during that campaign, and that was none other than Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt of the 1st Regiment of Volunteer Cavalry, better known as the Rough Riders. And the Rough Riders, the 1st Volunteer Cavalry, fought alongside the 9th Cavalry during the San Juan Hill campaign, and they got to know each other. Not real well. I mean, one was a senior officer, the other one was a junior officer. One was a volunteer, one was a regular. But Theodore Roosevelt was a well-known individual already at that time, and was definitely a larger-than-life character. I think everybody can agree about Theodore Roosevelt that way. And Theodore Roosevelt, in his post-war memoir on the Spanish-American War that he called The Rough Riders, he actually mentions Lieutenant Hartwick by name in his book. And there was a little bit of a disagreement between Lieutenant Hartwick and a couple of the other officers of the 9th Cavalry with Theodore Roosevelt's depiction of the battle. Roosevelt, he's one of my favorite presidents, but he definitely had a huge ego in life, not just when he was president, but when he was in the Army, in the Spanish-American War, in all forms of life. He had a big ego, and he gave himself more credit than he deserved in leading the charge up San Juan Hill. In reality, instead of one officer taking it under them, to themselves to lead the charge, it was ordered by the higher command for them to advance, and it ended up a number of officers from a number of regiments that kind of led the charge up the hill. It's just Theodore Roosevelt had the best PR agent ever, namely himself. But let's not take that away from him. But Edward Hartwick was there serving with him. And besides Theodore Roosevelt, another individual that he knew from that time period, not necessarily knowing well, but was another young lieutenant from the other Black Cavalry Regiment, and that was the 10th Cavalry Regiment, and one of their lieutenants, a first lieutenant, so a little bit more senior than Edward Hartwick, and I believe he was the acting commander of his company, and that was Lieutenant John Pershing, best known as Blackjack Pershing, that he became to be known as because of his serving with black troops. But he was involved with the 10th Regiment of Cavalry, and they served on the other side of the 1st U.S. Cavalry of the 1st Volunteers, the Rough Riders. So they were not right next to the 9th, but they were all kind of together on the same line. And because the Army was small in Cuba, the officers tend to get to know each other, especially those that were professional officers who had come through West Point, like both Hartwick and Pershing did. So the war ends with the American victory. And in the case of Hartwick, he returned to his life as a second lieutenant in the cavalry with the 9th. And after they returned to the United States from Cuba, his regiment was posted no longer at Fort Robinson, which was desolate, but not nearly as desolate as where they were headed to. And that was Fort Huachuca in southern Arizona, not far from the Mexican border. And it's terribly not far from the city of Tucson, but I don't know Arizona in 1898, 1899 of the size of Tucson was at that time. But Fort Huachuca was in the desert. It was hot. It was dry. It was dusty. And at that same time, Lieutenant Hartwick, now promoted to first lieutenant, was getting married. And he had been engaged to Bessie Mickelson, Karen Mickelson, and he went on leave, went back to Grayling and married, and then they returned as a married couple to Fort Huachuca. And I think, again, the writing was on the wall that here he was now he was 28 years old about that, and he was, or 27, 28, and he was just finally promoted to first lieutenant. He had been in the as a commissioned officer now for 6 years, thereabouts. And that's not a very quick promotion. And if there continues to be no activity in the West there was no longer any fighting with the native tribes, that advancement was very unlikely, or at least quick advancement. You had to wait for those that were higher or above you on the rolls, the officer rolls, to retire or to die. And then you would kind of move up, and it was slowly. You know how seniority works. So they decided this might not be how they wanted to spend their life. And Karen Hartwick had some connections, of course, back in Grayling. Her father was involved in the lumber business. The Salling-Hanson Company had been very successful. There was also the Mickelson-Hanson Company and several other lumber projects or lumber companies that they were involved with, along with other jobs. And so Edward Hartwick did resign his commission. They returned to Grayling. However, he did not initially go into the lumber business with his father-in-law. He first took a job as a cashier for the Grayling State Bank, the bank in Grayling. And cashier was not like the cashier in the bank now, where you just work the desk there, or however they're doing it nowadays. It's not like it was when I was growing up. But the cashier at that time was basically the person in charge of all of the banking operations that was done daily. So they usually sat at a desk at the rear of the counter and overseeing everybody who worked there in the bank. So it was a decent position. But about a year later, in 1900, he bought out the shares of Thorwald Hansen, a son of Rasmus Hansen, in the the Mickelson-Hansen Lumber Company, a retail division of it based in Mason, Michigan. And they were operating retail lumberyard down there. So Edward Hartwick and his young wife, Karen Hartwick, they moved down to Mason, Michigan, and they were there for a time. And then Edward Hartwick was able to get into a partnership with a man named Thomas Woodfield in the city of Jackson, south of Mason, and right on the Michigan Central Railroad line, along with a number of other railroads. And they had a thriving retail lumber company, lumber yards, and selling lumber that were transported on the railroads. And they did that, or he continued in that line to 1909 when he moved to Detroit. The family now included two young sons, Edward Nelson, who went by the name Nelson, and Robert Hartwick. And in 1911, another son would be, 1910, another son would be born, Edward Ernst, but he unfortunately was a child that I think today would be classified as that he had Down syndrome, and he lived just over a year and died in 1911. But the Hartwick family, they moved to Detroit, and he started the Hartwick Lumber Company, and again, a retail lumber company. And Detroit was a competitive city for lumber. It was a growing city. It had a lot of retail lumber outlets there and wholesale as well. They also did wholesale lumber. But he ended up with 5 locations in the city prior to 1917 when he rejoined the Army. So they became very successful. He also was involved in a number of other businesses, partners in other lumber companies, both in Jackson and in Detroit. He continued involved with the Woodfield Hartwick Lumber Company even after he moved to Detroit. He just didn't take active everyday, leadership of the company at that point. But so the Hartwicks, they went from Grayling to Mason to Jackson and finally to Detroit. And it was in Detroit where they were living in 1917 when the United States finally entered the First World War. I say finally because if you're not up on World War I history outside of when the Americans joined in 1917, the war actually began in 1914 and had been going on for almost 3 years before the United States finally entered the war. And we're not going to get into all of the politics of that, but just for the fact that when the U.S. joined the war efforts, France and Britain, fighting on the Western fronts, were in dire need of support, not just of manpower from other allies coming into fight, which the United States would send quite a few soldiers. Well over 1 million soldiers would end up fighting on the Western Front by war's end, but also in a lot of support services. And from the beginning of when the United States entered the war, Edward Hartwick tried to volunteer to come back into the Army to fight. And he was rebuffed. He was 45, going on 46 at the time of the American entrance into the war. And he was considered old to be, volunteering for the Army. Of course, there were a lot of senior officers that were of his age. If he had stayed in the Army, he might have been a colonel. He might have been a general at that point. John Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, as I mentioned, he resurfaced. Well, not really resurfaced. He continued in the Army. And in 1916, in what was called the Punitive Expedition to Mexico, when we had an incursion into Mexico after Pancho Villa had attacked American towns and an army camp in New Mexico across the U.S.-Mexican border, we retaliated and went back in, and the Army forces that went into Mexico were led by Brigadier General John Pershing. And some of those troops that went along with them were the 10th and the 9th Cavalry regiments. So he was involved. He had been higher up now at this point. He'd been was a commanding general, but he still had the Buffalo Soldiers fighting with him. And he was named the commander of what was called the Army Expeditionary Force, or the American Expeditionary Forces. And the AEF went to France, and the manpower was meant to, in the eyes of the British and the French, they would be brought in as reinforcements and brought into British units and French units and help fight there. But Pershing wanted all American forces to fight under the American flag together, and he did get his wish, and the American Army then stayed together for the war. But this was, a contemporary of Hartwick who had rose to the command, where Hartwick, had he stayed in the Army, could have been to that level. It's impossible to say. But as a volunteer officer coming back in, he was turned down initially, and he tried many ways, connections through politicians in Michigan, U.S. senators, representatives, through connections in the Army of officers he had known. Unfortunately, Adna Chaffee had passed away in 1906. He had risen after Cuba to be the Governor General of the Philippines. He fought in the Filipino War at the tail end of the Spanish-American War in the Philippines, where the Filipinos wanted their independence like the Cubans did. They were not allowed their independence, not until 1946, after another World War. But Adnan Chaffee was the civilian governor general there for a time period. And then when he returned to the United States, he became the chief of staff of the United States Army, the highest ranking general of the Army. But then he retired in 1906, and he died in 1916, so just prior to the United States entering into the war. And had he been alive still, I'm sure that he could have had some pull to get Edward Hartwick a commission, but he had passed away at that point. But the forestry part that he ended up being in, that was recognized as something that was needed greatly by the French, by the British, and then obviously then by the United States. And I'm going to go in here. I have a book, a biographical sketch of Major Edward E. Hartwick, together with a compilation of Major Hartwick's letters and diaries written during the Spanish-American and World Wars, written by Gordon K. Miller. It was a privately published biography that came out in, I want to say originally published 1921. So as a memorial to Edward Hartwick. And this is a reprint that was published in 2015, and I bought it at Hartwick Pines State Park. But I was lucky enough to have, not in my personal possession, but in the possession of the Logging Museum when I worked at Hartwick Pines, was Karen Hartwick's personal copy of the biography, and we had it in our collections. And I read the book that she held. It was pretty amazing to be able to hold that book and to be able to read it. And thankfully, from one of the copies that somebody was able to get use of, and they made a reprint of it finally, almost a century later. But the first forestry regiment of engineers, the 10th Regiment of Engineers, was raised, and they went to France in September of 1917. And right about that same time was the 20th Regiment of 20th Regiment of Engineers, Forestry, was created. And that was when finally that Edward Hartwick was allowed to volunteer his services. And he was commissioned as a major in the Army Reserves and was selected to be the commander of the 1st Battalion of the 20th Regiment of Engineers. Excuse me. And the 20th Regiment was initially created with 10 companies, but then an additional 9 companies were added to it to be at 19 companies. It was the largest regiment of the United States Army during the First World War. And to be the battalion commander of one of these, that was pretty impressive for him. But he was selected because of his experience. He had been an Army officer. He had commanded soldiers. Yes, he was a junior officer as a 2nd lieutenant and then 1st lieutenant, but he had commanded soldiers in battle. And although he would not see battle in France, that was important leadership skills and qualities that he had. And then he was successful in his civilian life in the lumber industry. And the engineer battalion were made up of foresters, of loggers, of lumbermen, lumberjacks, mechanics, sawmill operators. All of these men who worked every day in their civilian lives doing the work that they were called on to work for in the Army. And so the men that you wanted to lead them were men that knew exactly the job that needed to get done. And Edward Hartwick was one of them. And Hartwick himself like he was a straightforward man. He didn't make waves. He was not an officer that was going to take a lot of risks. He was really, above the board type of officer. Kind of boring, I bet some might have called him, but he was well respected by his fellow officers, his commanding officers, and also by his soldiers. And there's a couple of things that I want to read in here. Well, first of all, Hartwick, he took command of his battalion at American University in Washington, D.C. That was where the camp was at, and that was in September. And they only had a month and a half, 2 months to prepare before they went overseas. And he did kind of a very, quick training for the men to become soldiers. And on November 11th, exactly 1 year before the armistice, the ending of World War I, they embarked for France. And they arrived in France on November 26th. And then he would he took command of his battalion, and they ended up in Dax in southern France, south of Bordeaux, where they would do working in forests, logging, and would do quite a bit of work. Let me try to find here in the book of what they did here. Okay, here's quoting from the book here. It may be remarked in passing that the Forestry Service was one of the most important branches of the United States Army. The necessity of timber in tremendous quantities was constant, and the Allied leaders looked to the United States to contribute materially to the forces engaged in supplying this timber. Wood was needed in the construction of dugouts, trenches, barracks, hospitals, roads, walks, camouflage screens, bridges, etc. The need may be better emphasized by the statement that one French Army Corps utilized 30,000 trees in 1 day alone. The 20th Engineers Forestry was under the command of Colonel W. A. Mitchell, U.S. Army. The personnel of the ranks was foresters, woodsmen, and sawmill workers. Each battalion contained 3 companies of 250 men each, and they were designed to be 10 battalions with an additional 9 service battalions. I think I said companies. I meant battalions. Thus making a regiment of over 17,000 men, the largest in the world. So you can see that the work they did was tremendous. And God, I used a word that is used by somebody else that I'm not a fan of, and all of his hyperbole. But it was a very important work that they did. And they did quite a bit of it. And so Major Hartwick and his men were delayed in beginning the actual operation of sawing lumber by the failure of the American mills to arrive. All the equipment that the United States Army was using, or most of it, was coming across the Atlantic Ocean from the United States. And it took a while. They didn't have the fast transports that they would have in the Second World War. These were all older steamships burning coal, and they did not go nearly as fast as ships that were now being built during that same time period, the warships. The transports were definitely slower. So each battalion was supposed to have had a complete outfit for logging and sawmill operations. Small mills were purchased from the French, however, and regular work was done until the arrival of the American machinery in March of 1918. The 20th also laid many miles of railroad track and sidings for troop trains. Shortly before his death, Major Hartwick was engaged in the construction of ice houses, the largest for the manufacture and storing of ice in the history of the industry. The lumber for these was taken by the engineers from a 50-year-old forest. So the forestry operations, they were very expansive. And not only did they have to cut the trees down, but just like in logging in Michigan and the Great Lakes region, is they had to lay out roads, they had to lay out railroad lines, build those, and so they needed all of their routes of transportation as well. Now, a lot of that was already built in to the infrastructure of France that I will get into in reading here by Edward Hartwick, but it was definitely not something that could just be done very quickly. They had to time it. And as I kind of give a little bit there, that he died before this work really could happen. And unfortunately, illness was common in the Army, especially when large amounts of men congregate together. Cleanliness, hygiene kind of takes a back seat, and that includes the healthiness of their drinking water. Now, at some point during his time there in France, in southern France, Edward Hartwick, during the winter there, it would have been February, early March, that he contracted pneumonia. And it was pretty severe, but he was improving from it. He was healing, and he was coming back from it. And then he took a turn for the worse. And it wasn't the pneumonia hitting him again. It was cerebrospinal meningitis. And this was nearly always at that time a fatal disease. And it is caused by bacteria in unclean drinking water, just like many diseases at that time. Typhus and dysentery and cholera. So many of them came from drinking water that was unhealthy, that was dangerous, unclean, and that was not unusual when you had large amounts of men or people living together close to each other, and you have their facilities for sanitation were not that great. And it was close by where they got their drinking water from, and there was cross-contamination. And Edward Hartwick came down with a severe case of cerebrospinal meningitis, and it was fatal for him. And on March 31st, 1918, Easter Sunday, he did die from that disease. And it affected those who knew him well. And I have a few memorials here of him that I want to read out of his book here, or out of the book. But the first one I want to read was a regimental special order, headquarters, 20th Engineers, National Army. That was the name of the volunteer army. Regimental Special Order Number 2, 31 March 1918. 1. It is with deep regret that the commanding officer announces the death of Major Edward E. Hartwick in Dax, Landis at 3:25 p.m. today of cerebrospinal meningitis. 2. Major Hartwick was a graduate of West Point and for several years an officer of cavalry in the United States Army. He resigned during the period of peace and engaged in the lumber business, where he promptly rose to prominence. At the time of the declaration of war against Germany, he was president of the Hartwick Lumber Company, Detroit, Michigan, but he put aside personal interests in order to serve his country and accepted a commission as major of the 1st Battalion, 20th Engineers. 3. Major Hartwick possessed in an unusual degree the qualities needed by the officers and soldiers of the United States Army. He was patriotic and loyal to the extreme, steadfast in his devotion to duty, capable and energetic at all times, and his personal example was always an encouragement to his men. 4. In these times when hearts are tried, strength is tested, and lives are lost, it is expected that many of us will follow him in death, and we must all try to serve our country as well and faithfully as he has done. 5. Commanding officers of all companies and detachments of the 20th Engineers will assemble their troops at 4 p.m. Saturday, April 6, and personally read this order to them. W. A. Mitchell, Colonel, 20th Engineers, National Army, commanding. So that was the official notification of the death of Edward Hartwick. But he had, there were soldiers who definitely that were saddened by the death of him. And one soldier, Private M.F. Malone, wrote a letter to Karen Hartwick. And this is what he said. I am only a private, but having been in the office with and around the major since the organization of his battalion in Washington, I naturally came to know him, and I consider it not only an honor but a revelation to have been associated with and commanded by a man of his character and ability. He was never tiring in his labors, never weakening in his undertakings, and always looking out for the comfort and welfare of his men. He was faithful to his country, he was faithful to his family, and thus he came to the end of a perfect day on this earth. And now I would write across his records, here was a man and a soldier to the end. Finally, the last words I want to say here are, and this was written to Karen Hartwick on a telegram on April 16th, 1918. My dear Mrs. Hartwick, I have learned with genuine concern of the death of your gallant husband. His going to war as he did was entirely characteristic of him. These are very hard days for all of us. One of my own sons has been grievously wounded, and at least I can assure you of my most heartfelt sympathy. Very respectfully yours, Theodore Roosevelt. This was 1918. Roosevelt would die in 1919, but of course, besides being with the Rough Riders in Spain and Cuba, he would be president of the United States from 1901 to 1909. He would also run again in 1912, but not be elected, of course. So Theodore Roosevelt, again, one of the great figures of his time, also took the time to pass on his condolences to Mrs. Hartwick, because he did know Edward Hartwick, not very well, but he certainly did know him from their time in Cuba. So Edward Hartwick was certainly a figure that should be remembered on Memorial Day and in Michigan history, not necessarily for his great gallant bravery in war, but as a decent, solid officer who led his troops both in peacetime and in wartime, in combat and behind the lines, and also was a good father, was a good husband, a good businessman, and just a very good individual. When he died, he was buried at the American Military Cemetery in Bordeaux, and that was on April 1, 1918, the day after his death. But then his body was exhumed in 1920 and brought back to Detroit and reinterred at Woodlawn Cemetery on Woodward Avenue, just right at 8 Mile Road, right at the northern border of Detroit. And Woodlawn Cemetery is a beautiful cemetery. If you ever get a chance to visit it, go around and take a look at all of the various names in there. There's Dodge in there. There's a number of other Detroit. I'm not sure if the Fords are buried in there or not, but there are a number of Detroit movers and shakers. But Edward Hartwick has a very beautiful monument, and Karen Hartwick is buried next to him. And then just off to the side is Nels Mickelson, his father-in-law, because when he retired from the lumber business, he moved to Detroit, built a mansion in Detroit that was later owned by Berry Gordy of Motown Records fame. So they had a strong connection to Detroit beginning in the early 1900s. And Karen Hartwick then, of course, she always wanted to memorialize her husband in some way or another. As Hillary Pine mentioned in the episode in February, go back to that episode and listen to it if you haven't yet. Hillary's a fantastic historian, but she talked about how Karen Hartwick was persuaded to purchase the land that was still owned by the Salling Hansen Company. At this point, it was the Hansen family, and to give it to the state as a memorial to Edward Hartwick. And that was how Hartwick Pines was created in 1927, and then officially dedicated as a state park in 1935. So this ends part one of this episode. I will be back with part two as a second little mini episode that I will also try to post today. If not today, it will go here later in the week, because next week on June 2nd is going to be when we have the beginning of season 2. Didn't expect to have these episodes this week, but however, I wanted to do something for Memorial Day. And of course, I didn't think about it till just 2 days ago. So part 2 is going to be about the 20th Forestry Engineers and their work they did in World War I and the First World War. And some of that will be with readings from Edward Hartwick's diary. I was going to try to include that in this episode, but I've gone just a little bit longer than I planned. Yes, I talk, as you've all know by now. So stay tuned for part 2, and thanks for listening today. And as always, if you enjoy the episode, share it with others, pass it along, tell a friend, download, hit like wherever you can, and hopefully soon there will be subscription that you can subscribe to the podcast. So thanks for listening, and that's it for now. Bye. North Country History with Rob Berg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Berg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Berg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Berg, Environmental Historian.